Screen. Here we go. Okay. So we're again in Sefer Yetzirah. We have gone through most of the first chapter. There's another few Mishnahs left in this chapter. I think it goes up to 14. And we're on 111 right now. What we've been doing in this chapter is essentially tracing the ideas and development of what is called the 10 sefirot haganuzot, the 10 hidden sefirot, or according to some explanations, the 10 sefirot, the 10 sefirot that are in the light itself, rather than the 10 sefirot of the vessels, because we didn't really get to vessels. In fact, we only start to get to vessels, or the concept of vessels, in this particular Mishnah. Prior to that, we were speaking about Keter and Chochmah, which are as yet, Keter is completely unformed, Chochmah is a point, but is not yet expressed. And we'll get to more of that today, more of that explanation today. But now we're about to go on to the explanation of the sefirah of binah, which is the third sefirah, Keter, Chochmah, binah. As everybody knows from the chart of the sefirot. And if anyone needs a chart, you can let me know by email. I'll send you a copy of a chart of the sefirot. But they're easy to come by. Okay, so let us now look at this Mishnah. As usual, I will start off by reading the Hebrew, and then we can look at it in English. Shalosh, the third sefirah. This is what we're talking about. This binah, shalosh, right? Mayim, ruach, water and wind. Chakak v'chatzav. He engraved and he carved out. Bahen, in them, in mayim and ruach, in water and the wind, so to speak, or air. He carved out chaf bet otiyot, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet is actually only 22 main letters. There are 27 letters altogether because some of the letters, 5 of the letters, Mansapach, the letters Mem, Nun, Tzadik, Pei, and Chaf, come in 2 forms. When they come in the middle of the word, they're one form. When they come at the end of the word, they take a different form. They're called a long letter. As you can see, for example, over here, this letter over here is a Tzadi, which is a long form letter, this letter here, right? That's a long form letter. But generally, and here you have another example of a long form letter, which is the Nun. So Man, Tzepach, these are the ones here that have a long form. They have 2 forms. Okay, there's the long form at the end, and here's the short form, or the smaller form in the middle of a letter. You see 2 different nuns, but they're both pronounced the same way in any event. So there's 22 letters, 22 main letters. Mitohu vavohu, from chaos and void. That's the way it's usually translated. And that's the way Rabbi Kaplan translates it as well. We are going to express it somewhat differently, but for now, let's just translate it that way. Refesh v'tit, which is sort of mud and clay. Refesh is mud, v'tit clay. Chakakan, this is all completely not understood until we go into the explanation. It's very mystical and very hard to understand without proper explanation, but we'll get to that. For Chakakan, he carved them out, or he set them in a carved manner. Kamin aruga, like a garden, sort of a garden bed. Chatzavan kamin choima, and he hewed them out like a wall. Sivavam kamin ma'aziva, and he put a roof over them. He rounded them or covered them like a ceiling. We're talking about the letters here, the shapes of the letters. That's really what we're talking about. Yatzakaleim sheleg, and he threw upon or poured upon them snow. V'nase afar, and it became afar. It became dust or earth. Shenemar, as the verse says, Ki l'sheleg yomar have aretz. To the snow, he said. This is a verse in Job, actually. To the snow, he said, become earth, or go down to earth, be down on earth. Now, all of this is completely not understood. Let's just read it in Rabbi Kaplan's translation over here. He said, 3 water from breath with it, engraved and carved 22 letters from chaos and void, mire and clay. He engraved them like a sort of garden. He carved them like a sort of wall. He covered them like a sort of ceiling and poured snow over them and it became dust. As is written, for it to snow, he said, become earth. I don't know why he translates this as become earth. It really should be translated as go down to earth, be down on earth, fall down to earth. In any event, that is the explanation, that is the translation that he favors, whatever. We will go through it in some depth because, as you can see, it is completely mystifying as to what it's talking about. Okay, so as I started to say in the beginning, the idea here is that we're talking about the emergence of the sefirot from Keter and Chochmah, and then the third sefirah is binah. So when we mention the word shalosh, 3, the third sefirah is the sefirah of binah. The first sefirah is Keter, then Chochmah, and then the third one is binah. So we're talking about binah. And it is in binah that the letters become formed. Now, this is very much like the idea you find in Kabbalah that Chochmah and Binah are generally compared to father and mother. In fact, they called one of the kinuyim, one of the nicknames, so to speak, of Chochmah and Binah is Abba ve'ima, father and mother. Why? Because they bear that kind of relationship. These sefirot bear that kind of relationship of a father to a mother, father and mother together, as Chochmah to Binah. Sorry about that. Switch it off. There we go. So they bear the relationship of Chochmah to Binah, of mother to father. Now, how is it so? Of father to mother. How is it so? As you probably know, the formation of a child in the mother's womb comes about primarily. It takes place in the womb of the mother, obviously. That's when the child is formed, but it comes from the drop of semen, which comes from the father, the drop of energy, the drop of, in the case of the sefirot, this would be called the drop of light. The point of light that comes from Chochmah is then developed in Binah. So the idea is that in the analogy, the drop from the father is developed in the mother. And they work together as partners because the father without the mother would not produce any children, and the mother without the father would also not produce any children. You need both of them. Both of them need to operate together, to work together. And that is the idea of how Chochmah and Binah operate, just like parents operate in forming a child. Most of the work, obviously, is done in Binah, and this is what we're going to talk about, why the third sefirah is the one that develops this seminal drop into a complete array of, in the spiritual sense, a complete array of ideas and expressions and an array of letters. This is what we're really talking about. Okay. So this has to do, therefore, with the development of the letters in the spiritual sense. Now, where do they come from? The original drop contains within it everything that will be developed later on within the womb of Binah, so to speak. It's all there in the drop, in the seminal drop, but it's there in such a way that it's in a state of, it's in an undeveloped state, In other words, it is, that's what's called, in this context, that's called Tohu. In other words, undeveloped. Tohu generally has a negative context in the beginning of creation, when it says, Tohu vavohu, was chaos and void. Right here, we're not talking about chaos necessarily in a negative sense. It just means in a state of pre-development. Afterwards, comes the somewhat more developed state, which is called bohu. There's tohu, and then there's bohu. Tohu vavohu, right? The land was chaos and void. That's the way it's usually translated. But bohu means over here that there's something there. There's something starting to take shape. There's something starting to form as a certain construct that will later on become fully developed. And this is, again, referring to the letters. And the letters are called, in this particular stage, they call sort of like a garden. He engraved them like a sort of a garden. He carved them like a wall. He carved them like a ceiling, etc. What does it mean? It just means that there's different shapes to the letters. The ones that are like the are rounded. The rounded letters are like a wall, and then there's ones that are like a ceiling. In other words, they have a top and bottom aspect to them. And then there's long ones like a garden patch, like a patch of flowers that is, a row of flowers in a garden. That's basically the which, once water is poured into this sort of channel, then the water stays in and irrigates the flowers, etc. In any event, these are only images to sort of give a person the ability to imagine, to form these shapes in one's imagination, essentially. But all of these are happening within binah. All of these different developments are happening within binah, and we can understand it in the following way. Let's say a person has an idea, a eureka kind of idea, eureka, right? He has this flash of insight, and the flash of insight, he needs to first even explain it to himself before he can explain it to anybody else, even before it comes out of his mouth. And when he explains it to someone else, he first has to arrange it in exactly what is this flash of insight. When Einstein came up with E equals mc squared, eureka, that eureka moment or whatever it was, how did he first start to understand that sudden insight that he had? How did he understand it? How did he explain it to himself? Well, the original idea, the flash of insight, that is typical of the sefirah of Chokhmah. That's what Chokhmah is. It's a flash of light, a flash of insight. It's a point of light. But now it needs to be developed in thought. Before developed in speech, it needs to be developed in thought. It needs to think about, the person who came up with the idea needs to think about all the ramifications of it. What is it related? What other ideas is it related to? How do you develop this idea into a way that can be expressed and passed on to others, transmitted to others, and so on and so forth? It starts to take shape. So that's exactly what's happening between Chokhmah and binah. Chokhmah is the flash of light, the flash of insight. Binah is working out the thing in your mind, trying to figure it all out before even speaking about it. But the letters of thought, so to speak, are already far more tangible, if you could say tangible about letters of thought, but certainly far more tangible than the original point of light of Chokhmah. In other words, they're graspable. This is something I can comprehend. This is something I can put into letters, I can put into thoughts. The original insight is now put into an array of thoughts that that develops the original insight into an entire, let's say, an entire theory or an entire philosophy. Okay. Now, all of them, obviously, all of these letters are, so to speak, originally included in Chokhmah, but they're not visible in Chokhmah. They're invisible. They're just a point of light. There's another analogy which they use to explain it, that if you take a pot of water, you don't see, the pot of water is clear. Like you don't see any dust or any residue in the water itself. But boil away the water, until you boil it away completely, then you'll find like this white residue remains on the sides of the pot. What's that white residue? That's the white residue that was included in the water originally, with minerals and so on and so forth, that you didn't see. They were just simply part of the water. But through boiling of the water away, the residue becomes visible. Similarly with Chokhmah, it has kind of these letters, this dust, so to speak, within it, but it needs binah to boil away the water in order to reveal the crumbs of dust. I don't know if you can say crumbs, the whatever it is, the dust that's in the mineral dust that's in the water itself. That's an analogy again of making the insight of the sudden flash of insight of Chokhmah, bring it into the letters, the mind letters, not the word letters, but the mind letters of binah. Then it goes on to speak about how he engraved them and carved them and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's discuss that a little bit more. The Hasidic approach to the concept of Tohu in this context, again, the word Tohu we translated as chaos and void, but over here we don't mean it in that sense. We don't mean in a sense of chaos and void like destruction, right? Chaos and void like destruction. Rather, we mean it as existence which is so tenuous and so refined that we can't get a grasp on it. That's why it is called Tohu. It is in a state of chaos to our minds. In its own context, it's not in a state of chaos. But to our minds, it's chaos because we don't grasp it yet. So therefore, what has to be done is the letters have to be drawn out of Chokhmah, like the powder, like the minerals are drawn out of the water by boiling it off. In other words, binah now develops what's hidden in Chokhmah into the letters, and again into an entire theory, an entire philosophy. Now, who put the letters into Chokhmah? That's obviously Ein Sof, the infinite one, God, right? That's where it comes from. The letters did not come to Chokhmah by themselves. They were placed there. They were put there. And then the letters are carved out and then separated one from the other. That's what we said. They're carved, they're engraved, and they carve. First they're engraved, that's a higher level. Then they carved out, right? Engraved is part of the original thing. Carved out, now they become sort of separate from each other. They come as individual letters, so to speak. And that is that's the expression of carving and so on. So we explained before that that Tohu is not a negative concept in this context, but it is called Tohu because it has not yet been fully formed. It's still in a state of what's the word for it? Latency. Let's put it that way. It's a state of latency. And therefore it is hidden from the emotions and from the modes of expression, which would be the emotions are the sefirot of Zer Anpin, Chesed Gvura Tiferet Netzach Hod, Yesod, and then Malchut, which is the power of speech, Malchut Peh. Malchut is parallel in the body by the mouth. So the emotional and the mode of expression, sefirot, do not yet grasp this idea. Therefore, it is called Tohu. They're not yet affected by it. It's in a state of unknown. It's unknown to them, and therefore they regard it as, so to speak, Tohu. Now, there is another Kabbalistic work which is called the Sefer HaBahir, which is a very ancient Kabbalistic work, which comes from around the time of the composition of the Zohar, actually probably a little bit before the composition of the Zohar, Sefer HaBahir. And the Sefer HaBahir explains that Bohu is the lavush, it's the garment for Tohu. In other words, it's what sort of limits Tohu to, how should I say it? It makes it more graspable by putting a garment over it, so to speak. I guess you could say it's like throwing a sheet over a ghost, that kind of analogy. So therefore, Tohu becomes visible, more concrete, more expressed in the garment that covers it, which is called Bohu. In more Kabbalistic terminology, this would be called, Tohu would be called Sovev Kol Almin, the transcendent light, and Bohu is the beginning of immanent light, right? There's transcendent light, Sovev Kol Almin, and Mamalik Kol Almin, immanent light, the light that fills the world. So Bohu is sort of an in-between stage. It's the beginning of the idea of immanence, of immanent light, of immanent expression. And then it goes on to explain the various shapes of the letters. I don't think we need to bother too much with that now. Like a sort of a garden. In other words, those are straight letters. A column like a sort of a wall. Those are the round letters. A ceiling is letters with tops and perhaps with bottoms as well. But in any event, it's the various shapes of the letters, and we don't need to go into it too much. But what is this concept of that he poured upon them snow? He poured snow over them. What is the idea over here? In other words, for water to become snow, that's again, it's an analogy. When water is flowing, it doesn't have shape. Snow is already what's called in Hebrew nikrash. It became congealed. It's the water became congealed. The water became ice crystals, and ice crystals have a form. They have a shape. They have a particular, and when they become actually a block of ice, it has a very hard shape and very, excuse me, a very defined shape, not like water. So Chokhmah is compared to water. Binah is compared to snow. And that's called in the Zohar and various other places called Aglilu Maya, when the water becomes frozen. The water becomes frozen. In other words, when the idea becomes congealed into an expressible idea, at least expressible to oneself. And that is the idea of the letters being formed within thought, the letters of thought. Later on, they'll be expressed as letters of speech, which is again another further level down. Generally, Chokhmah is called Ayin, which means nothingness because it's just a point, whereas Binah is called Yesh, it's called somethingness because it expresses that and it builds it up into a construct, as we said in our original analogy with the sperm and the mother's womb. Okay, so also in some works they explain that this is the oral Torah. I'm sorry, the written Torah and the oral Torah. The oral Torah is Binah. The written Torah is Chokhmah. So the point of light is the written Torah, which needs the explanation of the oral Torah in order to bring it out. What is the oral Torah? Ultimately, the oral Torah became the Mishnah and the Talmud. Initially, the oral Torah was not written down. It was transmitted orally, as it's supposed to be, but the sages at a certain point in time came to the understanding that if they don't write it down, it's going to be lost forever, because they were going through the Roman occupation of Israel at that time, and the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of Jews from Israel to all corners of the earth, essentially. And therefore, they felt that it had to be written down, so they started writing down as the Mishnah, and that was composed in Israel. And then later on, there was what was called the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which was composed in Israel by Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan primarily, he was the author, the redactor of the Jerusalem Talmud, and then ultimately the Babylonian Talmud was actually composed in Babylon during the exile in Babylon, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, etc. centuries, where that was composed by Ravina and Rav Ashi, or Rav Ashi and Ravina. Those were the two sages that composed the Babylonian Talmud. And the Talmud then became a mainstay of Jewish jurisprudence, Jewish law, and is studied to this day. There are many, many study groups studying Talmud. The method of studying Talmud is very, very analytical. It is not, you don't learn things, you learn to analyze, you learn to think, and you learn to to dissect and to compare and to contrast and so on and so forth. That's what it's all about. It is a type of study which can take years and years to master, but that is probably the origin of what is known as the Jewish brain, where many Nobel Prizes completely out of perspective from the point of view of how many Jews there are in the world. Many Nobel Prizes were won by Jewish brains, because this analytical way of thinking became very embedded in our way of thinking in the Jewish people. In any event, I'm not saying that nobody else has it, obviously, but it is like part of the culture, and we're much more mentally oriented than physically, as you probably noticed. Not so many athletes in the Olympics are Jewish, but anyway, whatever. Let's not get into that now. The last part is when he says to the snow, descend to earth. I know that Kaplan translates it as become earth, but others translate it as descend to earth. What do we mean by that? We mean that this wisdom, which is originally from Chokhmah, becomes developed in binah, and then it is told, go down to earth. Who is earth? Earth is essentially human beings. Ultimately, in the more narrow sense, it's Jewish people who are called Eretz Chayfetz, the desirable land of God. Excuse me a second. Sorry, I just have a dry throat over here. They're called Eretz Chayfetz, the land of desire. Why? Because they're the fertile land in which ideas can be planted, so to speak. So the idea is that the snow, in other words, the binah, should descend to the land and moisten the land from up above. As the snow falls and it falls onto the land, it is initially in a state of it's frozen, but when it melts and waters the land and irrigates the soil, then it can start to cause things to grow. So the idea is that machshava habeduma, the original thought, the way things were in the original, now comes down to where it can be absorbed in the souls of and the faculties of the souls of human beings. That is the idea that the snow descends down to earth and covers the earth. Okay, so just to summarize briefly, 3 refers to binah, which is the third sefirah after Keter, and it's in binah that the letters begin to form. And the letters begin to form in various ways, which are compared to a garden, a wall, etc., a ceiling, and so on. And we mentioned the dust, the mineral dust that's in the water, and when you boil off the water, you find the mineral dust afterwards. That would be called Tohu and Bohu, right? The state of Tohu, where it's completely invisible, Bohu, where it starts to become visible, where you get the white dust at the end. And then they are they're actually carved into, they're engraved and then carved into various letters. And there's 3 kinds of letters that I mentioned here, but ultimately the carving is, as we'll find out in the next Mishnah, the carving is the 32 paths of wisdom that descend ultimately from Chokhmah into Zer Anpin, into the 6 Sefirot, from Chesed to Yesod. So binah is essentially the idea of Tohu, and Chokhmah is the aspect of Ayin, nothingness, and so on, as we explained. Snow is binah descending down to earth and moistening, waking up, enlivening the faculties of the soul. And that's what it's talking about. Okay. If there are any questions, we can address the questions. Write them in the chat. And I'll try and answer them now. It's still related to matter. Letters become matter. Yes. Letters become matter in the sense, not so much matter as they become solidified, and a combination of letters become matter. It's not just one letter becomes matter, the combination of letters becomes like a sort of like a formula, like a chemical formula, so to speak, or like an algorithm. The letters together is sort of an algorithm that runs a certain thing. In other words, the algorithm for stone would be the letters Aleph, Bet, Nun, right? Aleph, Bet, Nun, Even. That would be the algorithm or the formula for stone. It's those letters, in other words, the forces that the letters represent that form a stone. The word Adam, a human being, Aleph, Dalet, Mem is from those letters, from those three letters, and every creature, everything existing has its particular algorithm or its particular formula. These are actually revealed by those who know how to use it, by know how to analyze it, by the name of the thing. And similarly, the name of a person. The name of a person often reveals some of the inner qualities of that person if you know how to analyze it. Does it relate to letters presenting themselves to God in the Zohar? Is that entirely different? I'm not sure what you're talking about. The letters came before. In other words, he selected the letters. He formed the letters. It wasn't that they existed, pre-existed, presented themselves to him. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, but yes, these are the letters. That's the letters on the highest level, the letters as they are seen, so to speak, by God. Then there's the letters as they are seen by the mind, and the letters that as they are pronounced by the mouth. And finally, the letters that are actually embedded within physical creation. There's various different levels of letters. There's actually many different levels, but there will be levels for each one of the worlds, 4 different levels for each of the worlds, and then there's prior to the worlds and so on. The letters in the light, the letters in the vessels. These are all yeah, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about that measure right at the beginning of the Zohar over there. Yeah, right. Yeah, I hear. They can't do it on their own, right? And then the first letter is the letter Bet, and of course it stands for the word Bayit, which means a house, and that houses the entire creation, so to speak. Yes. Any other letters? Any other questions? Okay. All right, folks. I'm planning on having a class tomorrow night, unless something untoward happens. But I'm planning on having a class tomorrow night, where we're going to discuss. Also, again, at the same time, we're going to discuss the same time, same link. We're going to discuss a section of the Zohar that is said before the Sabbath, or the evening service of the Sabbath. Someone asked me to explain it, and I'm going to do that tomorrow night, hopefully. And it may take more than one class, but we'll see. All righty, folks, have a good one. Enjoy the weather your end if you if you don't have weather like ours. But all the best. See you tomorrow night, hopefully. Night. Shabbat shalom.